Okay, testing. This is exercise number 1, problem number 1 at the end of chapter 9 in the Albright VBA text. Let's walk through this. Number 1, write a sub that creates an array day of size 7 and then populates it with the days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and so on. It should then loop through this array and write its elements to the range A1 through G1 of the first worksheet. So here I have a worksheet. We're going to write the days of the week in this space. So let's do some code. First thing is I notice it says size 7. So we're going to create an array called day of size 7. What that implies is that we want to put in an option here of base 1. So I'm going to come here to options underneath my option explicit and put option base 1. That means we're not going to do 0 based indexing. We're not going to start our array from 0. We're going to start our array from 1. And we'll come in and we'll create a sub. I'll call it day sub. And I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the method that was shown just above exercise 1 here at the very end of the chapter, where it created an array of values inside of the code. So the rest of the previous chapter, or the previous to this in the chapter, almost all of the arrays, in fact I think all of them, were created by pulling information from a spreadsheet. In this case we're actually pulling the data of the array, we're putting it into the code directly. So I'm going to follow this model here. I'm going to declare day as variant, and I'm going to create the variable day equals, I'm going to use the array function, and I'm going to type in the days of the week here in quotes: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, quote, comma, space, quote, Friday, quote, comma, space, quote, Saturday, and Sunday. And at the very end, I'm going to close with my parentheses. And that will give me my day array. Now what it wants me to do is create a for loop. So I'm going to do for I equals 1 to 7. Now the problem here is I haven't defined I yet. There's no variable I. So I'm going to come back up and declare. By the way, I like to have my next in there right after I type my for loop so I don't forget it. But I'm going to come up here and declare, another variable. I as integer. That's just going to be my counter for my for loop here. And inside of this loop, I'm going to list the days to the spreadsheet. Let me do a little comment here. List days to spreadsheet. Maybe print is a better way to say that. Print days to spreadsheet. It used to be that when you printed something, you would print it to the screen or to the printer. So print here is an old term. So what's the code for this? So for each I, 1 through 7, I'm going to print this into a range on the sheet. So I'm going to type in my range A1. I'm going to do an offset because I want it to change for each day of the week. And my offset's going to be 0 on the row because it's all going to be through row A1, which is row 1. So my row offset's going to be 0. What's my column offset going to be? It's got to include the I. But if I include the I by itself, that means it's going to start in the B column. It's going to offset 1 because 1 is my first I here. So what I want to do is I actually want to do I minus 1 as my column offset. That's going to put me back in cell A1. So that's going to be my column offset. And I'm just going to click on dot value or type in dot value. What does that equal? That equals day for the variable I, and I is my integer. That's my counter here. So what am I doing? I'm saying in that cell, A1 offset, the first one's going to be 0, 0 dot value equals day 1. That means the first, because we're doing base 1, the 1 here is going to be the first element in that array. And I've got my next and end sub. So let's test this. If I hit F8, F8. F8 creates the array. Now, if I wanted to, I could come down here in my immediate window and I could say, okay, let's see, what is day one? Sure enough, Monday. So it's created the array, and now it's going to start the loop. I can click on, let me go ahead and click F5 and see what happens. Boom. It went through that loop very fast. It put all of those days into the spreadsheet, just as it's asking here, A1 through G1, and we are done. Okay, at this point, let's go ahead and move to exercise number 2. And in this case, what we're looking for is to end up something like this, where we have the months from A1 to L1, and then the number of days in each month from A2 to L2. So let me go ahead and delete this and read the problem. Write a sub that creates 2 arrays. We're going to have 2 arrays, a month array and a days in month array, each size 12. Populate the first with the months, populate the second with the number of days in each month. Then loop through these arrays, write the elements to the range A1 to L2. Cells A1 and A2 will have January and 31. So let's start. I'm going to go ahead and continue with the option base 1 as instead of zero-based indexing, I'll use 1 for my arrays. And we'll just go ahead and create a sub. I'll name it 2 arrays. You can name it anything you like. We're going to create, just like we did in the previous problem, 2 arrays. One is called month, the other is days in month. We're going to name the variants as variants so that we can create them here in the code itself. So I'll use an array function which puts the values into the month variable, the month which is now going to be an array variable. And what are the months? Let me type them in here. January, February, March, April, almost forgot there, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. And next we'll create our days in month. And this is also going to use the array function. Here we're going to type in the values of the number of days per month. And let's see, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. And that completes the creation of those 2 arrays. Now we're going to create a for loop, and we're going to need a counter. So I'll do 1 to 12 because I know there's 12 months. So I'm going to come up here and remember to declare my counter I as an integer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a place to put this. So I'm going to do range A1. I'm going to go ahead and do an offset again, just like I did before. The row is going to be 0 offset. The column, I have to subtract 1 because I'm starting with 1 here using option based 1, which is sometimes easier to keep track of the numbers in your array, the indexes in your array. So I'm going to do the offset for the column here as I minus 1. And that's going to be so that I can start with A1. If I didn't have the minus 1, the offset would be B1. And so if I did that, January would be my B1. I'm subtracting the 1 from I to be 0, right? The first one, I, is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. That's going to give me A1. So the value of that cell is going to be equal to the month. And what I need to remember is to include the I of the month. That's going to allow that month to change for every I. And then we'll also do the range for a 2. We'll do a similar offset. We'll do I minus 1. We'll do a dot value. And that's going to equal days in month I. And we'll hit enter there. I'll go ahead and click F5 and run the program. And we'll see how it turns out. Boom, there, sure enough. Here's the months of the year, and here are the number of days in each month. Hopefully that's correct. I think that's pretty close. Okay, one more exercise here. This is going to come from problem number 8 at the end of chapter 9. The question says, the file high spenders, which I've copied here to this file, contains a list of customers and the amounts they spent during the past month. Here's the customers, and here are the amounts that each customer spent this last month. This says write a sub that captures the existing lists in 2 arrays and then creates 2 new arrays of customer names and amounts spent for customers who spent at least $500. After these new arrays have been filled, write their contents to columns D and E of the worksheet. Okay, so we're going to need to create some arrays here. Let's go ahead and create the sub. I'll call it high spenders. And let's create some arrays. I'm going to create one array for customer. And I'm going to manually input 1 to 93. And remember, as the book states, this goes beyond just 0. It starts with 1. I can specify that as I'm creating it. I'm going to create the second array, amount spent, and name that as a currency. I know I'm going to need a loop, so I'll go ahead and type in my I variable as my counter. And let's go ahead and start that counter. What I want to do is I want to go through this list and put both of these columns of values, the names and the amounts, into 2 different arrays. So I'm going to say for I equals 1 to 93. I know there's 93 because I've already checked, right? I know that if I select all these cells, the count here says 93. So I know there's going to be 93 customers that I need to go through. So I'm going to do for I equals 1 to 93. And I will finish my for loop by typing next before I forget. And we are going to put values into each element in the array. What's the value going to be? It's going to be a range, and that range is going to be from the spreadsheet. I'll use an offset, and I will use the I as my row offset. Notice here my range starts with A3. If I start with the A3 range, then my offset down to 1 when I is 1 is correct on the row, and I can do 0 for the column. I'll add my dot value property, and that will stick the value of that offset into customer I. We also want the amount spent array, so I will create an amount spent with an I designation for each time this loop runs. And the range here is going to be B3, and I'm going to offset that also by I and by 0. And what this is going to do is my offset here is going to be B3. So when I is 1, it's going to offset 1 row to B4. And the column is 0, same column. It's going to grab that 520 and just put it into the first element in that array. At this point, we're ready to check to see if each one of these amounts is greater than 500. And it does say at least 500, so we're not doing greater than or equal to, we're saying greater than $500. So I'm going to come in here, and this is where I'm going to do a if logical statement. If the amounts spent of I is greater than 500, then I want you to do something. And I'm going to go ahead and type my end if here so I don't forget. So what this is saying is we've just created the amount spent I in this line. Now we want to immediately check that in this line. If it's greater than 500, what are we going to do? Well, because not all of these are greater than 500, here's some that are not, we actually need to create another counter, a way to keep track of how many are greater than 500. So I'm going to come back up here to my variables, and I'm going to declare another variable. Let me come down here a bit. Number found. And that's just going to be a way to keep track of how many have been found. So if amount spent I is greater than 500, then we're going to create this counter. We want to increase the counter by 1. Number of found is 1. Then what we want to do is we want to add the customer and the amount spent to these two new arrays that we're going to create. And let me come up here and declare those arrays. So let's do customer over. And I don't know yet how many are going to be in there, right? I don't know. I could count. I could cheat. I don't know if cheating is the right word. I could look, right? I could look on this list and I could count how many are over 500, and I could put a number in here. 1, 2, I don't know how many there are, 50, let's say. If I don't know how many, I'm just going to leave that blank. I'm not going to put anything inside these parentheses, but I'm going to create that as an array. And it's going to be a string because we're going to have string characters. These are going to be the names in this array. And I'm going to create another array for the amount spent. And this one is going to be currency array. And that's going to contain all of the amounts in that array. But again, I don't know how many are going to be in there. So now that I've created these two, I can come back inside this code, and if the amount spent is greater than 500, I'm going to increase the counter, and I'm going to redim. I'm going to create or redeclare an array, and I'm going to change how many elements are in this array. Now the book talked about the use of the function or the word preserve. What that means is it's not going to erase everything inside of the array. It's actually going to keep that. So if I use the word preserve, it's going to keep the data that I have inside that array. For the first time, if there's nothing else in, then there's nothing to preserve. But after there's something found and put into that array, it's not going to erase it. If I do not include the preserve word, just the redim, it would erase everything inside this array. So I need to make sure that I include the word preserve. Now let's talk about this part. So I'm going to resize this array, but I don't know how big to make it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase it from 1 to the number found. And I'm going to preserve everything that's in there. And so if the number found goes up, I'm going to increase that size of customer over to whatever that new number found is. And the same thing for the other array. I'm going to preserve the amount spent over, which is the new array. And I'm going to go from 1 to the number found. Now that I've resized both of these arrays, I actually want to put the data inside of the array. So I could come up here and put a comment that says resize each array. And then I could put another comment down here that says input data into arrays, just to help me with my code, be a little bit more transparent about what I'm trying to do, and for future people that might use this code, but also to remind myself. Here's my new array, and I'm going to put in the first element. So the number of found here is the new count for these new arrays. So I'm going to use that as my index as I put data into this array. The new found array is actually going to be the data from the other counter up here, right? So if this amount spent is greater than 500, we know what the customer and amount spent is. We're going to put that value into the new array at a new index, which is the number found. And then the same thing for the amount spent. We're going to put the index, given the number found, inside of the amount spent over array equal to the amount spent of I, which we already know is more than 500. So that's how we are checking to see if the amount is greater than 500. If it is, we'll increase the counter, we'll resize the array, we'll input the data that we found into those new arrays, and we'll go to the next customer. The last thing that this problem asks us to do is to display these new arrays in columns D and E. And we can do that with another for loop. We can use the same counter, but this time, how many are we going to count to? We're not going to go to 93 because we already know there's at least 2 that we know of, and there's probably more below, that are less than 500. So we have to go less than 93. What's the number that we can go to? We can go to the number found. We can go 1 to the number found, and we'll create a next statement here. Give us a little space. What are we going to do for each one of these? We're going to display them. I'll start out with range D3, and I'll do an offset, and the row is going to be I, because I is going to go 1 to the number found. Column is going to be 0 because it's the same column D. And the value is going to be what? It's going to be the customer from the customer over array. Which index is it going to be? It's going to be I. That's the index that we want. That's the index of the customer from the new array that we want to put into that cell. And then we'll do the same thing for the amount spent, except that this range is going to start with E3, which is column E, with a very similar offset. We're going to offset I and 0 on the column, the same column. We'll do the dot value property is equal to amount spent over, which is the new array that we're creating here, and the index is going to be the number found for that array. And that's it. And that should produce 2 lists here, 2 arrays of customers that spent over $500. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to expand my Excel sheet out. I'm going to click inside the sub. I'll click F8, F8, and we've started the loop. We've created data inside of these new arrays now. So if I come to the immediate window, just to check here, I can say, what is customer 1? Meaning, what is the value of the first element in the array customer? And if I hit enter and if I mouse over it, you can see it bar log. Sure enough, that's correct. So bar log is the first one in the array. That's great. And let's check. Let's do question mark AMT spent. Amount spent 1, 520. Sure enough, bar log 520. So this is good. This is correct. I'll click back into the sub, click on F8. If amount spent is greater than 500, then what? So sure enough, the 520 is greater. So we're going to go execute these lines of code. We're going to increase the counter. It's now 1. We're going to resize the customer over for that 1. We're going to resize the amount spent over array to be 1. And then we're going to put the data into that new array that we just found. So in found is 1. After I hit F8 here, I can come down here and check. Let's check. Question mark customer over 1. What is the meaning? What is the first element in the array customer over? Sure enough, it's bar log. So we know that works. I can push F8 again, And now we've pushed the amount spent, which is 520, from the amount spent array into this new array. Why? Because it's greater than $500. So we can check that. Let's see, question mark, amount spent 1. And I hit enter and 520. Sure enough. So we've put that amount into the new array and we're ready to end the if statement and go to the next customer. And let me go ahead and put a block here. And what I want to do is hit F5 and run through all of this code to create the two new arrays. And then we'll pause and we'll check these two new arrays, and then we'll follow up with the rest of the code. So I'll hit F5. We've created all of these arrays. If I come down here, if I do upper bound customer, that's going to tell us that there's 93 elements in the customer array. If I do the up U-bound customer underscore over, that's going to tell us that there's 43 elements in the new array, which means what? That means that the code found 43 customers with an amount spent greater than $500. Okay, so now that we know that, we can, and let's just check as well, since we're here, let's check to make sure that the amount spent over array has the same number. It should be the same, right? U-bound is talking about the upper bound. Sure enough, I put my mouse over it. I'll click enter, and there it is, 43, which means that these two new arrays that we created both have 43 elements in them. That's a good sign. Now we'll unblock it. A left click. By the way, the block is to left click. So if you left click in this gray bar right here, you can create a block, and you can run the code all the way to that block. So I'll unblock it by again clicking left mouse click in that space. And now I'm going to click F8 and I'm going to step through this one. F8, F8, F8. And there it is. There's bar log and 520 because those are the first two. Those are the first elements in each of these arrays over $500. So I'll click F8 again. I'll click F8 a bunch of times. And what we should see here is we would expect to see only amounts in this list greater than 500. And that looks like it's correct. We've got a 510, 540, couple 600s. I think we're good. Now I'm going to click F5, back in the sub, click F5 to finish. And sure enough, it prints all of the others customers in the two new arrays. So let's go ahead and count. If I select this data, the count is 43. So they all printed, and that looks good. Again, what we've done is we have created two new arrays. We've inputted these data into two arrays, all of these columns, all the way down into two arrays. We've checked to see if the amount was greater than 500. If it is, we have a counter, and then we resize two new arrays, and then we copy the data into those two new arrays, and lastly, we have a loop that prints these two arrays in columns D and E. And that is this problem. Problem number 8 in the textbook.